So you already heard my argument for the 90s being possibly the best decade for fantasy. So the natural follow-up is the 2000s, right? But are the 2000s one of the worst decades for fantasy? I don't know. Let's take a look. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to be doing a follow-up to the Decades of Fantasy kind of series, I guess. This is number 2, so it's officially a series now. And after doing 90s, I asked which decade you'd like to see. A lot of people just said, hey, 2000s makes sense to go next. And so I started looking. And the 2000s, I usually think of as, your Golden Age Sanderson, the early books. You had Elantris, you had Mistborn, you had Warbreaker, his early books that tend to still remain the fan favorites. Way of Kings was 2010, so it does not count. But it's interesting because you have the Sanderson stuff, and then we're not going to talk about it here, but the 2010s, I feel like especially you got a lot of this sort of, Sanderson clone stuff kind of happening. But I think about that a lot as being one of the big things here. And I was trying to think, because whereas when I think about 90s, I was able to just come up like, this series, this series, this series, this series. But 2000s had a little bit of a harder time. So I know it sounds like I'm just, baiting you with that intro, but honestly, let's talk about it because there are some notable series here, but there aren't nearly as many as you might think. I will say the thing to note specifically is when we're talking about this, we're talking about new series starting in the 2000s. So I had the one about the 90s. I'm talking about series that are starting in the 90s. I don't care if it's, like people brought up series that still had things published in the 90s. I'm kind of targeting the start because I feel like when you're trying to look at a decade and capture like what really was going on, you want to see what are the series that started, what are the things that were new. Legacy authors that are still publishing, of course, are going to be a thing. They're like some of the series you talked about there, Realm of the Eldlings, Wheel of Time, etc., had books published in the 2000s, but we want to look at new ones. So I mentioned Sanderson. You had Elantris, Mistborn, Warbreaker. Those were all in the 2000s. Those are pretty popular, and I know that not everybody loves them, but those are the ones that the early books, besides Way of Kings, those are the ones that I've gotten the leather bounds for. I didn't do Era 2. I actually ended up really liking Era 2 overall, but it is kind of that early Sanderson that tends to be some really fan favorites. You do also have some notable book ones or series that were starting, like The Lies of Locke Lamora, The Gentleman Bastards by Scott Lynch. And speaking of books that the first books that still aren't finished, Name of the Wind started in the 2000s as well, although I still haven't read it, and I mean, if he ever finishes it, I will, but that's a whole nother video right there. So a couple of really big notable things like that as well. And then, you have things like American Gods was in the 2000s, which is, not the start to a series, but I figured notable enough to bring up. You had Temeraire started in the 2000s, the Demon Cycle I got over here, 2000s, as well as Bujold's The World of Five Gods, which is just off camera here, but that was the 2000s as well. The Wizard Knight Gene Wolfe, I figured I would mention since that was a thing as well. But see, already I feel like I'm sort of stretching with a couple of these that are like a standalone or a duology. There's not a lot of these really big series going on at this time, at least that I'm thinking about. Now, there's probably some people who are like, what about? Yeah, I'm going to mention them, but some series that I've not been as huge on, I figure I'll mention as well as some other just notable popular ones because First Law did start in the 2000s. I'm not a fan, but that is, I think, honestly, is one you have to mention when talking about it because First Law was very influential with, as well later on, what ended up happening with a lot of the focus on Grimdark, which I also think is something that 2010s had a big part of that as well. Dresden Files, also a pretty notable one from the urban fantasy side that's big as well. And I feel like also that, that started and that becoming very popular also definitely, I think, influenced the next decade as well. So, you have to keep in mind that those ones are not, I'm not a huge fan of, so I'm not going to rank super highly. You also have like Rhaeria started in the 2000s, and then ones that I'm not ever going to read, but that are very popular, the Kushiel books. I can't remember what that series is actually called, but that started in the 2000s. Twilight, figure I got to mention it, also highly influential, even though not for me, obviously, and probably not for anybody watching this video for the most part either. But those are some big ones. But the thing that I thought was most interesting, and like I said, I was actually really struggling with the 90s. I just basically, like any of my favorites and a lot of really big things, I was finding so many different things and not having a lot of trouble finding stuff for the 90s. The 2000s, and let me know if I've missed stuff, obviously, here, but the 2000s, I did really struggle to find a lot of stuff, and there are definitely some big highlight popular ones there, but I had a little bit of a hard time. What I thought was interesting, though, is if you look at the YA or kids books, because the 2000s have the start of the Aragon books, the Inheritance Cycle or whatever, the Percy Jackson books, the Artemis Fowl books, the Bartimaeus books, and the Spiderwick books. Now, Artemis Fowl I read when I was a kid, when I was younger, and then the Bartimaeus, I actually started rereading that this year, and I didn't end up finishing. I didn't DNF. I didn't have time to keep getting to them. And so and I did read some of the Percy Jackson ones when I was younger too. So like, it's interesting actually that, a lot of those younger reading books that are still very popular started around that time. So I don't know necessarily what that says about the decade, but it's interesting that you had a lot of those. And then I think though, the thing that is still worth mentioning about the 2000s, while there's not like a huge amount of really not a huge amount of series, a lot of the ones that were there were really influential. Sanderson, Abercrombie, Rothfuss, Butcher, I would probably put in there too. Very, very influential. Liza Locke Lamora, The Gentleman Bastards, also really, really big series is talked about. It's just, if it had been finished, it'd probably be looked at maybe a little bit different. As well as, like I said, some of the ones that aren't for me as well. But so there's a lot of things that had a huge impact, but it feels like kind of a quiet decade in regards to the actual publishing. And a lot of series, when I was trying to look, I'm like, oh, what about this one? I'm like, oh, nope, that's 2010 after. So the 2010s, you'll have to let me know in the comments if I should just keep going and do the 2010s. I feel like I can't do the 2010s I can do, but then after that, I can't really do a decade because we don't know where it's going to go yet, but I could do that and then go back from there. Or if you just want me to go back too, because I feel like some of the older decades would be interesting to talk about, but let me know with that, just a side note, which decade you might like to see. But I do feel like a lot of 2010 stuff was very influenced by the 2000 stuff, what we did have. But it's interesting to me just that there weren't a ton, and maybe it's just, genres can have a little bit of a lull. I know, love him or hate him, Sanderson had a really big part in revitalizing a lot of fantasy what's going on there, but it's that and Abercrombie kind of going the other way with the grimdark and making that kind of stuff popular, even though his stuff's not particularly grimdark, even though it's a term that he kind of popularized there. But a lot of books started going that route. A lot of books started going the Sanderson route later. So interesting. But for me, this may end up being, maybe I'll have to go back afterwards in retrospect and check, but this might end up being one of the worst decades of fantasy taken as a whole, even though there's some big notable things in there, just because I feel like most decades are going to have a little bit more to offer. But hey, who knows? This is only the second video in this series. So let me know your thoughts on 2000s. Do you completely disagree with me? Do you have some big things that I missed? Because obviously, I can't talk about everything with it as well. But I'd be curious because, like I said, with 90s, it was so much easier to do than 2000s, and I feel like if I go 70s, 80s, there's a lot of things that can immediately come to mind. 2000s was sort of a hard decade, so really curious to have your thoughts. Let me know whether or not you agree or disagree here. I'm sure there'll be plenty of both, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would love to hear from you, and otherwise, make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the links in the description, as always, for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizardly Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether any of these books, other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you, and of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.